All right. This is Shawn Henry, the Chief Security Officer of CrowdStrike and the President of CrowdStrike Services. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today to talk about how we empower CISOs to help to protect their organizations in the cyber realm. And I am very happy to have with me today CJ Moses. CJ is a former colleague of mine. When we worked together at the FBI. I retired from the Bureau after 24 years as Executive Assistant Director, and CJ and I worked many years ago in the National Infrastructure Protection Center, really in the early days of cyber, working against nation-state adversaries as well as organized crime groups and the like. CJ is currently the Deputy CISO at AWS, and he's been the acting CISO at Amazon for the past several months. And we are also very happy to have him as a member of the CrowdStrike AWS racing team. He's a driver at the racing team and a phenomenal resource and a good colleague and friend. CJ, we've been investigators for the past 2 decades, really on the front lines. We're not sales guys. We're both operators who have really done a lot of the hard work with our teams, leading people and responding to some of the most significant incidents in the world. When I think about where we are now, kind of racing into the unknown in our time in history with the current pandemic that we have, we're seeing assaults on democracy across the world, not just in the US, but globally. And we're seeing this uptick in these destructive cyber attacks, ransomware, many attacks like Shamoon, NotPetya, that are destroying networks. I think that so many of the skills I've seen you demonstrate as a race car driver, kind of the speed and the precision, the commitment that you have to your craft, the good judgment that you have to exercise, the passion that you have, those are the same qualities that are critical to being a successful CISO. And when you're driving out on the track, you're always assessing data, because these cars are really one giant computer nowadays. But there's also this physical component of the race. In addition to all the data you're analyzing and you're making adjustments, you're worried about your competitors on the track. You're worried about the track conditions, the weather conditions, et cetera. You and I have talked before about the 360 degrees of cybersecurity, how you look at the entire attack surface. I think that's really a good place for us to start here today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I like to think of from a CISO perspective is that the CISO is responsible for the 360-degree threat landscape. Essentially every part of security. I know that CISO, means information security, and in a lot of organizations that kind of rules out physical security. But the reality is that protecting the information or being able to protect information requires you to be able to deal with all the threats. I always like to tell my team, when it comes to either driving a race car or protecting our data and our customers' data, probably the biggest thing that I like to tell them is that it's their job to be tactically impatient, strategically patient. The idea here is that if you know what needs to be done and you have the path, take it. In race car driving, that is, if an opening between cars opens up, you take it. You put your nose in there, you get it done. Same thing applies when it comes to threats or other types of things to our environments. If you know what needs to be done, go and take care of it, get it done. Strategically, from a race car perspective, we spend weeks, months, years, whatever it takes in order to engineer and to put together the best car possible, as well as preparing as a driver to be able to be most impactful on the track as you can be by training. Same thing applies along those lines from a strategic perspective. When leading a security team for an organization. And those are the types of things that allow us to be effective in that space. We've seen, as you brought up, there are a lot of different, a lot of threats that are presenting themselves, sometimes repackaged. the pandemic and a lot of the things that are happening these days, we're starting to see similar threats that we've seen before: ransomware, phishing and malware, or other things that are just repackaged to be more current from the standpoint of drawing in the attention of others. Trying to find the adversaries are trying to find weak people to be able to prey on. We've seen this, especially some of the things that we've seen more recently, external data breaches that include passwords and things like that are then used or tried to be used on our platform, basically password reuse. So other breaches then becoming a problem for us as a community, because people like to reuse passwords. So obviously there's one way to deal with that, is to try to get people not to reuse passwords. That goes into training. But there's also, a need to push for more multi-factor authentication. I think, from a threat landscape, we're also seeing, phishing and malware scams being combined with social engineering. So having people that are actually reaching out to, whether it's employees of different companies. I think the best example of this more recently is probably what happened with Twitter. They were very public with what happened there, essentially, social engineering of employees, and then subsequently sending them phishing emails that then provided further access that they found and were able to shut down, but not until after there's been some impact. And so we start to see here, obviously, the need for a lot of training for those individuals that are getting this kind of social engineering, because humans have best intentions, but best intentions can fail. And the other thing is obviously limiting the access that even well-intentioned employees have through least privilege, limiting that impact radius, if you will. Probably one of the other areas, real quick, that we tend to see a good bit of impact within the industry, especially across. We have a broad landscape, if you will, a global landscape of Amazon and AWS. So we almost have a little bit of an internet weather service where we can kind of see where things are happening and what's going on. And by the use of Falcon, it provides us that visibility across that global infrastructure. And some of the things that we're seeing within that space is targeting of our supply chain as a whole globally. I think this is standard for the industry to some extent as well. Third-party suppliers are targets, and if all of us as CISOs or protectors of our customers' data or our data have a requirement to provide due diligence to protecting that data, regardless of where it may lay. If we are using a third-party provider and providing them access to PII, or intellectual property or otherwise, it's our responsibility to make sure that they're maintaining the same or better security bar, as well as those different things that we would have internally. Some of the things that we've seen working, throughout the industry is, log retention time periods. May not always be as robust as we may need in order to, if there something does happen, or if you want to see if something did happen, you need to be able to have logging and along those lines. And some of the best practices that we've worked towards is not only relying on those third parties to maintain those logs, is that we get the logs in near real time, such that we can do analysis on them and alert on things in our own environment, as well as wherever our data may lie. So there's a lot of different things. As a CISO, you have to take ownership. That's probably one of the things where I'll kind of, stop in this space and to say that the CISO's role doesn't stop with just the virtual or cyber environment. CISOs are responsible for, all of the aspects of protecting your and your customers' data, and that a CISO must take total ownership for the security of that data. And that doesn't stop, with just being in the space of, virtual environment or the cyber. It goes all the way through to the physical, the securing of data centers or otherwise. It may not be your primary responsibility, but there are those within your businesses or otherwise that are, and therefore it's your responsibility to make sure those things are being done to the bar that's necessary.
No, that's a great point that I want to pick up on when you talk about the physical piece and certainly protecting data centers. I remember when we were in the NIPC, and there was this question about, you worry about these remote attacks, but if you leave the back door open and somebody walks in and pulls a server out of your building, or throws in an incendiary device and creates havoc that way. But when I think about currently what's happening now, you and I for many years have talked about this physical aspect, and at the end of the day, there's a human being at the other end of the wire. Too often people think about malicious ones and zeros that are coming across as the real threat vector, but those are just the vehicle. The intent is launched by a human being. And what we've seen just in the last 2 weeks here in the US, although I've seen it elsewhere as well globally, is people physically targeting employees of companies to get them to be complicit in their attacks. So as an example, as you know, just reported in the media in the last 2 weeks, in Tesla, a Russian citizen who allegedly attempted to bribe a Tesla employee to introduce malware into the Tesla environment in order to be able to extort Tesla for money. And the bribe offer was $1 million US to the employee. And this is coming from the US government, who was part of the investigation. I don't have any inside information, but just what's been reported publicly. On top of that, we saw similarly a former US military, highly regarded special forces operator who had top secret clearance at one point in his career. And after he got out of the military, or in coordination with his efforts in the military, he was involved in cybersecurity, in the cybersecurity space and intelligence. And again, according to the US government, he had allegedly been working going back to the mid-1990s as an asset for Russian intelligence service. And then here he is in today's world. He's been charged with working as an asset for the Russian intelligence going back many years, but in his most current day was working in the cybersecurity space. And the idea that somebody has that great background and capabilities, the type of person that you would want to hire into your company, but that is potentially or allegedly in this case operating on behalf of a foreign intelligence service, and how do you protect against that? So I think that there's this whole concept when you talk about the CISO owning information security, but the absolute requirement to be working in coordination with the physical security people. Is our data center protected? Are the employees who are touching our data, our source code, our hardware, have they been fully vetted? Are there processes in place to make sure that we can identify if somebody is engaged in malicious activity? They may be a disgruntled employee. Maybe they're not even working on behalf of a foreign intelligence service, but they have problems or concerns with their current employer, and they want to have a negative impact on the company. So that whole concept for me is so important, and I think too often people forget about it.
Yeah, the human aspect of the business that we're in, I think, like you said, is normally lost on a lot of people when they think about this. They're thinking about the ones and zeros, not thinking about the human behind the keyboard, whether witting or unwitting. Meaning that we have insiders that are intentional in what they're doing, whether it's through bribery or otherwise, or for other purposes. But then you also have the well-meaning employee that thinks they're being helpful and gets socially engineered over the phone to say, oh, well, I'm the help desk and I need you to do this in order to help me fix that. And they want to be helpful and want to do what's right. And they unfortunately aren't witting to the fact that they may be doing something very bad. These are the types of things that we as security professionals need to enable those people, or train. So training is one way, but then even more so than even the training, I think creating mechanisms to be able to prevent these things from happening. But even when they do happen, because invariably there's always the edge case that's something, works around many of the mechanisms, to be able to quickly alert on and disable those threats, the potential for breach or the access to information. I can't say it, any more clearly than, the biggest threat to our data, to the data we're protecting, are the people that have access to the data. And it's not that people intentionally always have to be bad or intending to be bad, but means that if people have access, it can be used by others in order to do something nefarious with that data. And the whole idea of least privilege and limiting the access that any one individual has at any period of time is very important. What do I mean by that? Is that, one of the things at Amazon that we've done is year over year, we've actually gone ahead and taken goals across the company to reduce access, human access to critical data, to customer data, for example, on the AWS side of the house, by 80%. And we did that not one year, but multiple years in a row. If I asked you, decrease access to certain types of data 10%, you'd likely, if you had 100 people working on that program that had access, you'd probably cut 10 of them out and you'd have 90 people that still had access. But if we change the model, the mindset to 80%, you're not going to be able to do the job if you continue to do it the same way. So we want to meaningfully drive down the amount of access that our employees have to data, not only because the possibility for insider threat from that perspective, but because we know that if anyone has access to the data, or the more numbers that data is accessible, the more risk that it presents. So the idea of doing 80% year over year means that people have to think about how they protect data or how they provide access in a different way. Just-in-time access is a good example of a way to get to an 80% solution, meaning that when you're on vacation, you should not have access to the totality of all of what you normally would have access to. You may still need access to email, but you probably don't need access to the data shares within your company or within the cloud. Things like that. If you're, normally a software development engineer and you're out on vacation, you surely don't need access to the source code that you were working on when you were on call or on duty. So creating mechanisms that, in the physical world before the pandemic, literally, if people badged in some cases, badging in at the door would actually allow them then access within the, to be able to have access virtually to some forms of data or to be able to do their job. The same thing can apply for those of us that use VPNs to access into our environment. If you haven't authenticated through to the VPN, at least on the front end, you shouldn't be able to even have access to some of the other data behind that. So the entire model set up such that least privilege and limiting the amount of access that employees have helps to contain the blast radius at a minimum, such that if something bad does happen, it's not as broad as potentially what we saw in some of these other incidents with Tesla and Special Forces operator, Twitter, places like that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, to your point, exactly what you're saying, and I want to use a word and see if you agree, it really is creating the proper culture, right? It's getting everybody thinking about things in a certain way. First of all, understanding what the risks are, understanding who the threat actors are, understanding what their objectives are, and really where the team, our security team, really becomes evangelists and help to create the proper culture. One of the things I've learned in my time in security is that the leader sets the pace for the rest of the pack. And if the people that are on your team, if they don't believe in the leadership, if the leaders aren't saying the right words, and most importantly, demonstrating the proper procedures and really mimicking or doing what you expect people to mimic, then you're going to have problems. And that's such an important piece. The companies that I've worked with that have been most successful in protecting their enterprise have been the companies that have had strong leadership and have developed a proper culture where people look, there's always going to be a failure somewhere along the way, but if you've got the right culture where people are focused and trained and they're executing properly as you've described, they're going to be in the best place to mitigate the attack and decrease the consequences and allow the company to recover more quickly. So really an important thing for us to do. We're coming up to the end of the time here, CJ. Perhaps you just kind of a closing comment, your thoughts on one of the most important things that our CISOs in the audience today should be thinking about and how they can best prepare themselves to be resilient.
Absolutely. I think you hit on it right there. And in my time, both I had AWS and then subsequently over at Amazon for a while here, I think one of the most important things that you can establish is a security culture for your company. An example being is that, whenever I'm leading my organization, it's not only the security organization, it's the totality of the business, making sure that from on high, from the CEO on down, that it's understood that security is, in our case, we like to say security is priority zero, meaning that it's job one, but it's the very first, being a binary organization, it's the very first thing that we do. And not only saying it, but actually acting upon it, meaning that if there is a service that AWS was going to launch, and in the security review and as part of the development of the program or the service, we determine that there's some sort of security issue with it, it will not launch. And that is how the mechanism that you have. One of the things that we do, as part of the learning that we talked about, is to have a weekly meeting with our CEO. The CEO actually calls the meeting. The CISO, myself, help chair the meeting, if you will. And any of the teams within the organization that have had any kind of security issue are called individually, get about 10 minutes, a 2-page document to explain what went on and how they're fixing it for the future. And invariably, it boils down to, a lot of times, the CEO, CISO, myself, actually having a discussion around the way that part of the organization is thinking, and making sure that they actually are putting security as the very first priority in their development, maintaining that mentality and making sure that's reinforced from on high, from the executive leadership, is the number one thing. And the CISO, if you don't have a CEO that's doing that today, you need to be the advocate for doing so. Don't sit back, because guess what? We all know, we've seen it in the press. When things go bad, who are they going to point at? They're going to point at all of us. So what we need to do is make sure that the CEO and the board of directors are aware of the risk that we have in front of us, and all of the things that we can be doing about them, and make sure that it's getting done.
I think those are great words on which for us to end. It's about leadership, and it's about urgency, and it's about passion and commitment. All the things I've seen you demonstrate as a successful race car driver and as a successful CISO, very highly regarded in the CISO community. And of course, our friendship going back many years. I'm honored to have served with you and to continue to kind of serve beside you with our partnership, and recognizing how important it is for us to stand on a line to help protect between good and evil.